We were roused in the dead of night, and not a single one of us asked any questions. The order was clear, the alarm sudden. When the radio crackled to life with the dry voice of our captain, everything became clear. We were about to undertake a mission of special importance. Months of grueling training had conditioned our unit to respond without hesitation and to operate under any conditions. We were 9 soldiers, a hand-picked team trained for the most challenging and classified assignments. No one complained or asked for explanations. We understood what such a call meant. We were given only the bare minimum of information. A signal had been activated deep within an abandoned Cold War-era base. Command suspected it might be a technical glitch or external interference. Access to further details was restricted, which immediately set us on edge, but orders were orders. Minutes after receiving the alert, we were already en route. The night road stretched endlessly before us. The headlights barely pierced the thick darkness, and the dust of the Big Bend wilderness settled on the windshield. We moved along nameless back roads that crisscrossed desolate plains, bordered by distant canyons and rugged mountain ridges. This region had once marked the border with Mexico, a natural barrier of cliffs and ravines. Few locals remained here, just scattered settlements accustomed to silence. No one questioned why a long-forgotten bunker lay hidden beyond a sand-covered road. The signal we had received originated from somewhere deep within the abandoned base. According to legend, the site had been decommissioned decades ago after the conclusion of some top-secret project. The details were locked away behind layers of secrecy. Even with our operational clearance, we were not told what had transpired there. All we knew was that this was the first signal in years, and it demanded immediate investigation. The engines of our vehicles purred at low RPMs to minimize noise. As we approached the designated point, we moved cautiously as if pushing through an invisible barrier. The captain, seated in the lead vehicle, occasionally issued curt orders over the radio. His voice was steady, devoid of panic. It couldn't be otherwise. We were prepared. Body armor, weapons, night vision devices, radios, all meticulously calibrated. At the checkpoint, we brought our vehicles to a halt. From there, it was a few miles on foot to the base entrance. The atmosphere around us seemed to tighten. No sounds, no wind, just an oppressive void. We quickly checked our gear and assigned roles. The captain took the lead, followed by scouts, an engineer, 3 riflemen, myself as the weapons specialist, and 2 others responsible for communications and electronics. We advanced along a narrow dirt trail, leaving the vehicles behind. In this darkness, where even the moon seemed hidden behind thick clouds, each step echoed unnaturally in our ears. The ground yielded slightly under our heavy boots. After a few minutes, we came upon massive gates partially embedded into a rocky hillside. The tunnel beyond led into the mountain, where the hidden life of the complex had once thrived. Now it stood silent, unguarded, and unlit. As we approached the gates, we noticed something peculiar. They appeared to have been opened recently. The heavy metal doors were slightly ajar, an odd detail that raised our suspicions. The captain signaled us to stop. Our engineer, a quiet but efficient man, inspected the mechanism and attempted to power it with a portable energy source, but to no avail. It looked as though the gates had been forced open or had moved on their own. The captain gestured for us to proceed. There was no turning back. We entered the tunnel. Inside it was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the beams of our flashlights. The light revealed rusty pipes, dangling cables, and chunks of crumbling concrete. Dust hung heavily in the air, clinging to our faces. After advancing a couple hundred meters, the tunnel widened into a main corridor. Tracks and signs of machinery suggested that rail carts or vehicles had once operated here. Now, only piles of debris, severed wires, and mounting brackets remained. Somewhere ahead we heard a faint noise, a dull sound like footsteps or air moving through the depths. Perhaps it was just our imagination. We set up a small portable jammer to try to establish contact with command. The engineer worked to configure the radio channel, but all we received was static. Communication was dead. No signal from outside. We attempted multiple frequencies, but it was futile. Something was either jamming us, or the interference was too severe. The captain pressed his lips into a thin line. He hated working in an information vacuum, but the mission demanded we continue. A few minutes later, we came across a side corridor. The engineer attempted to activate local emergency power, but the control panel he located was unresponsive. Power was either completely offline, or the systems had deteriorated beyond repair. We decided to stick to the main corridor, following the base map we had memorized before deployment. According to the documents, the layout was roughly as follows: a central hall at the core, branching out to residential and laboratory sections. As we moved further, a metallic screech echoed behind us. Turning back, we saw the massive gates we had entered through begin to slide shut with a grinding noise, as if obeying some unseen mechanism. The captain signaled the engineer to investigate, but it was too late. The doors sealed completely, trapping us inside. We tried lifting them manually and deploying hydraulic jacks, but they wouldn't budge. The engineer shook his head. Without power or specialized tools, the exit was sealed. We were locked in. Any chance of calling for backup? Zero. We tried reconfiguring the radio to different frequencies. Still nothing. It seemed we were entirely cut off from the outside world. Our only option was to push forward into the complex. Perhaps the central hall contained auxiliary generators. If we could activate them, we might restore internal systems and open an emergency exit. We continued deeper. The silence grew oppressive. Sand and dust crunched beneath our boots, every faint noise amplified by the void around us. Occasionally we spotted strange marks on the walls, deep scratches and dents, as if something had clawed at the concrete panels. No one had mentioned inhabitants like these. A creeping sense of dread suggested that something terrible had happened here. Reaching a larger chamber that resembled a central distribution area, we paused. Strewn across the floor were torn sheets of paper, shattered furniture, empty shell casings, hooves, and faint dark stains resembling dried blood. The captain motioned for us to spread out and search the area. We split into two groups. One was tasked with finding the control panel or at least an emergency power station. The other, which included me, advanced slowly down a side corridor that was supposed to lead to the residential sector. I followed close behind Ramirez, one of our riflemen. He was an experienced soldier, and having him there gave me a sense of security. Yet even his jaw was clenched tight enough to creak. We'd served together for a long time, and I'd never seen him this tense. Every yard of progress felt laborious, not physically, but mentally. It was as though we had trespassed into territory where we weren't welcome, but our presence was already known. When we reached the residential sector, the rooms were in shambles. Beds were broken, lockers ripped apart, and personal belongings scattered everywhere. Deep gouges scored the walls, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. We lit up one of the rooms with our flashlights and found an old placard bearing the insignia of some scientific division. The markings had faded, but we could make out the word project and the letter Z. It meant nothing to us, yet a sickening sense of foreboding began to stir. We continued our search when we suddenly heard a dull thud echoing from the far end of the corridor. The command came immediately. Lights out. We plunged into semi-darkness, relying only on the faint reflection of the occasional emergency lamps that still worked. The sound came again, closer this time. We held our breath. A quick flick of a flashlight caught a glimpse of something moving. Too fast to make out. The captain's voice crackled through the radio in a low whisper. "Stay sharp. Possible contact." We began retreating toward the central hall, intending to regroup. Whatever was behind us moved faster and less cautiously. The sound of shuffling, or perhaps claws scraping against concrete, grew more distinct. Suddenly, a muffled howl broke the silence, only to cut off as abruptly as it had started. We bolted forward, desperate to reconnect with the first group. When we arrived, we were met with a horrifying scene. Signs of a struggle, blood smeared across the floor, and scattered weapons. None of our team was there. It was as if they'd vanished or been taken by force. The captain's face went pale, though he kept his composure. He gave crisp orders to secure the perimeter and search for clues. One of us spotted strange tracks on the ground, deep, uneven impressions that looked like they'd been left by bare, clawed feet, though not entirely animal. The prints suggested that whatever made them had dragged its victim along the floor, leaving smears of blood in its wake. A chill ran down my spine. It was becoming clear that we were dealing with something far from human. The captain signaled for us to gather. His voice, though low, was firm. "Listen up. We're cut off from the exit. Communications are down and the gates are sealed. Our only option is to find an autonomous emergency passage or get the backup generator running. That's our best shot at getting out of here." His words felt like a lifeline of rationality amid the chaos. We nodded. Staying put was pointless. We had to keep moving. But now we knew something, or someone, was lurking in the darkness. Something capable of silently and swiftly taking down armed soldiers. We followed the trail of blood deeper into the corridor. It felt unnatural, but we had no other choice. Whatever inhabited this place seemed to be drawing us further in, toward the heart of the complex. Maybe there we'd find answers. Around the next bend, we came across the body of one of our teammates. His eyes were wide with terror, his chest torn open. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself not to look away. There was no longer any doubt. Whatever we faced wasn't just an animal. These were creatures with intelligence, or at the very least the cunning of apex predators. The captain turned to us, and his eyes burned with a mixture of anger and grief. We had lost people, and this wasn't over yet. Every step forward felt heavier. The tunnels seemed narrower, the darkness thicker, and the air staler. At one point we heard a strange sound like labored breathing coming from somewhere ahead. When we aimed our flashlights in that direction, we saw only an empty corridor. Then the sound stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. We were left with two possibilities. Either these creatures were testing us, or there was someone else in the complex. But who or what could it be? Human? Animal? Or something in between? We pressed on until we reached a fork in the corridor. According to the map we'd studied earlier, this should lead to a stairwell going up to the technical area, where the control panels might be located. If we could restore even partial power, we might have a chance to open the emergency exit or send a distress signal. The captain made the call. We'd head upstairs, to where we might find tools, power, and answers. I glanced back at the sealed gates and the vehicles we'd left behind. There was no turning back now. We were trapped. And what lay ahead was an unknown filled with the echoes of deranged experiments and horrifying creatures. We ascended a narrow staircase that led to the technical sector of the base. The steps creaked beneath our boots, and bits of crumbling cement fell away as we stepped over jagged edges. The darkness here was slightly less oppressive thanks to a few dim, flickering emergency lights. The thought of having no way out burned in my chest, but there was no alternative. Behind us were the shadowy corridors where part of our group had disappeared, and the gates that had locked us in. Ahead of us there might be a chance, however slim, of regaining control of the complex systems. At the top we were met with a broad hallway stretching deeper into the facility. On the right was a door labeled Technical Block A3. The engineer gestured toward it. According to the layout we'd studied before the mission, such rooms might contain distribution panels and possibly some tools. If we could get the backup generator running, we might restore power to the control systems, unlock the emergency exits, or re-establish communication. The captain paused, listening. His expression remained stoic, but we knew he was thinking about the team members we'd lost. He said nothing, only gave a curt nod to the engineer. The engineer approached the door, pulling out a compact drill and electronic lockpicks from his pouch. The door turned out to be mechanical, with a simple but heavily rusted lock. After several minutes of careful work, the heavy metal panel groaned open. Inside, we found ourselves in a spacious room lined with rows of shelves. In the faint glow of our flashlights, the floor was covered in dust and small debris. Some shelves were empty, while others held boxes of spare parts, cables, and tools. In one corner, partially concealed by canvas covers, stood 2 backup generators of modest size. Their condition gave us a glimmer of cautious hope. If we were lucky, at least one might still be operational. Our engineer and the communications tech, Sam, immediately began inspecting the generators. The rest of us assumed defensive positions near the entrance. Standing in the silence, I strained to catch any sounds from beyond the door. The entire complex seemed to have a life of its own. Faint echoes of footsteps, distant thuds, and rustling noises ebbed and flowed, turning the silence into a tense auditory game. The shadows cast by our flashlights on the walls seemed alive. Every so often I felt as if something was watching us from around the corner. A quick beam of light revealed only emptiness. "I'll try starting this one," the engineer said quietly. His voice was subdued, barely cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. He pointed to the generator that looked slightly better preserved. Sam assisted, handing him tools and aiming his flashlight at the mechanism. Ramirez and I took positions flanking the door while the captain stood just behind us, ready to coordinate. Costa, one of the riflemen, scoured the shelves for anything useful. A few minutes later, the engineer straightened up. "I'm going to start it. Stay sharp. It might get noisy." We exchanged glances. Any noise could attract the attention of whatever was lurking in the dark. But we had no choice. We needed light, and we needed functioning doors. The engineer pulled the starter handle, and the generator sputtered. It coughed once, then settled into a rhythmic chug, expelling stale air. A low, rumbling hum filled the room. On the panel, an indicator light flickered on. "We're live," Sam whispered with a faint smile. "Quiet." The captain cut him off. We froze, listening. The generator's hum was subdued but felt deafening in the surrounding silence. Then, a response. A distant roar, muted but unmistakably inhuman. This was followed by a short scraping sound, like claws dragging across metal. The noise stopped as abruptly as it began. "Looks like we've got their attention," I murmured. The captain nodded. "Sam, hook up the emergency circuits. Let's see if we can get some lights on. It'll make navigation easier." Sam quickly connected cables to a distribution panel on the wall. The corridor outside the door was soon illuminated by dim, flickering emergency lights. Most were burnt out or weak, casting eerie, stuttering glows on the walls. Still, it gave us a better view of our surroundings. Costa returned from the shelves holding a small box of ammunition and several old cutting plates likely meant for slicing cables. The captain assessed the find and distributed the ammo to those running low. Meanwhile, the engineer whispered, "I might be able to access a map of the doors and airlocks from this panel. If I can, we could unlock part of the passageways." The captain nodded. Sam flipped a switch, and a dusty old console screen flickered to life, as though it hadn't been used in decades. Characters scrolled slowly across the display. The engineer entered basic commands, navigating the archaic interface. After a few moments, the screen refreshed to show a simplified map of the sector. Several points were marked in red, others in green. One was blue. Red might mean locked doors, green open ones, the engineer speculated. That blue mark could be an emergency exit or a backup airlock. But it's deep in the lab complex further down the corridors. The lab complex, Ramirez muttered. So we're heading deeper in? The captain chose his words carefully as he looked at us. There's no other option. That's our way out. Engineer Sam, stay close and guide us with the map. Everyone else, form up at the door. We lined up, prepared to continue. I could feel the tension in the group rising. None of us knew what lay ahead. But one thing was certain. These creatures weren't staying put. They were either following us or watching us closely. We moved into the corridor, its walls lit by unsteady patches of orange light. Dust hung thick in the air, highlighted by the dim glow. Every step seemed louder now. A few yards in, we turned down a side passage following the map etched into the engineer's memory. Sam paused occasionally to check junctions and ensure we stayed on course. A sudden rustling noise from above stopped us cold. We aimed our flashlights at the ceiling, catching sight of a ventilation grate slightly ajar. For a brief moment, I thought I saw eyes gleaming in the darkness of the vent. My instincts kicked in. I fired a short burst into the grate. Bullets tore through the metal, sending sparks and fragments flying. A muffled growl echoed as something retreated into the ductwork. "They definitely know where we are now," the captain said grimly, shaking his head. We quickened our pace. The corridor led us to a fork with a faded sign. Laboratory sector. Right. The lettering was chipped and worn, but still legible. We turned right. The walls here were different. Tiled, though much of it was cracked or crumbling. The floor was smoother, free of sand and debris. It felt as if we were nearing a place that had once been the hub of scientific activity. Ahead, the sound of shuffling footsteps reached our ears. We froze. The captain raised his hand, and we fell into a line. I pressed the stock of my rifle firmly against my shoulder. Suddenly, a figure emerged from around the corner. It was tall but hunched over. In the beam of our flashlights, patches of fur stood out where human features should have been. Its eyes reflected the light, appearing dark with faint red glimmers in its pupils. It snarled, baring sharp teeth, and lunged at us. We opened fire. Bullets sparked off the walls, and some struck the creature, eliciting a roar. My veins surged with adrenaline. The creature limped, but kept advancing. Ramirez unleashed another burst, and finally, it collapsed, convulsing on the ground. As we approached, it was clear the wounds were severe enough to kill a human several times over. This confirmed one thing. They could be killed. They weren't immortal or spectral, just brutally strong, fast, and merciless. But they could be stopped. The creature was a grotesque hybrid. Coarse fur covered parts of its body, its face distorted almost beyond recognition, and its limbs elongated with sharp claws. Yet the remnants of human features were unmistakable. Its skull still bore traces of a human structure. The captain knelt to examine the remains. Breathing heavily, the engineer muttered, "It looks like genetic experiments were done here. Maybe they were turning people into something like this." "Project Z," Sam murmured, recalling the fragments of labels we had seen earlier. The captain stood abruptly. "We need to keep moving. If they're attacking us individually, it means the main pack could be nearby." We pressed on, determined not to linger. The corridor widened, and we entered a section lined with rows of doors, each with a small glass window. Some of the windows were shattered, revealing overturned tables, chairs, and broken machinery inside. One room reeked of chemical reagents. Another contained twisted, broken cages, as if something had been held there and violently escaped. Stopping at one of the doors, we heard a faint hissing sound from within. The captain signaled Ramirez to take a look. Ramirez cracked the door open and slipped his flashlight inside. The beam illuminated tables with strange instruments. A sheet of paper in a plastic sleeve hung on the wall. It was stained and smudged, but I could make out some of the text. ID effects, transformations antibodies, injection of stabilizing serum. One line caught my eye. Subjects begin losing human scent. Sam grabbed the file, squinting at the text. It looks like someone developed a serum to slow down the mutation. That could explain how at least one person might have survived among these things, if anyone's still alive here. The captain raised an eyebrow. "You think there's a survivor?" Sam shrugged. "The documents suggest some researchers may have known about this serum that delays transformation. If someone injected themselves in time, they might be half beast, half human, enough for the monsters to leave them alone." It was a wild theory, but in our circumstances, it felt plausible. Everything pointed to the likelihood that we'd encounter not just the creatures, but possibly their creator, or a witness who had survived. "If we meet someone like that," the captain said quietly, "do we try to talk first, or take them down without hesitation?" We exchanged uncertain glances. Making that decision would be a risk. But the captain's firm gaze silenced any doubts. "First, we talk. If that doesn't work, we protect ourselves. We need a way out, and every clue matters." We left the room and continued down the corridor. Soon we came to a massive door labeled Laboratory Z17. It was slightly ajar, and through the narrow gap wafted the acrid smell of burnt material and old blood. Whatever lay inside might hold the key to this nightmare. But before we could enter, a rustling noise behind us made us pause. For a moment, it felt like several pairs of eyes were watching us from the shadows. The captain raised his hand again. "Move forward. This area is too exposed for an ambush." We stepped into the laboratory and scanned the room with our flashlights. Equipment lay scattered everywhere. Broken test tubes, overturned documents, and shattered glass littered the floor. Charts on the walls depicted genetic models. In one corner, a refrigeration unit had been smashed open from the inside. Deep claw marks scored the walls. The place seemed like it had been a hub of activity before descending into chaos. It was becoming clear that Project Z had been an attempt to create invulnerable soldiers. But the results, evidently, had spiraled out of control. The engineer began searching for a terminal to check the status of emergency exits. Sam covered him while Ramirez, the captain, and I stood in the center of the lab, our senses on high alert. Somewhere in the corridors, a low growl echoed again. The creature we had killed wasn't the only one. Of that, we were certain. But now we had a plan. make it to the emergency exit, and hope it wasn't blocked. Failing that, we would try to re-establish communication. If power could be restored, we might send a signal through the underground antenna. Suddenly, the terminal let out a high-pitched beep, and the engineer cursed under his breath. The system's asking for a password. Without it, I can't remotely control the doors. But I did manage to confirm one thing. The emergency exit is on the lower levels, through the central biosector. The lower levels. We had just ascended to restore power, and now we were heading back down, into the dangerous corridors and the lair of these creatures. The captain nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. All right. We have a generator, some light, and our weapons. These things are vulnerable. That means we can fight through. In the distance, the brittle sounds of old beams or metallic supports cracking reverberated faintly. It felt like the base itself was resisting our intrusion. But we didn't waver. We had no other choice. We had to press forward, deeper. We left Laboratory Z-17, taking with us only fragments of information. The terminal had refused to yield its secrets without a password. But we now knew the emergency exit was located on the lower levels, through the central biosector. As we stepped back into the corridor, the flickering emergency lights blinked like a frayed nerve. The intermittent darkness, as if the world itself was blinking, gnawed at our sanity. But there was no turning back. A shadow darted across our path, perhaps one of the creatures watching us, gauging our movements. We didn't fire. Our ammunition was limited, and every shot risked giving away our position. Yet the feeling of being observed never left us. Tension mounted as we moved in a tight formation, constantly glancing over our shoulders. The captain halted at an intersection, consulting the mental map he'd pieced together, and motioned to the left. That route, according to his calculations, should lead to a staircase or a descent into the base's research sectors. We followed him. The engineer and Sam lingered slightly behind, occasionally pausing to check the dim terminal schematics we encountered along the way. Most systems were either offline or locked down. "Remember when we talked about a survivor?" Ramirez asked quietly, addressing me. "Yeah, the scientist who might have used the serum," I replied. "If he's still alive, it means he knows how to evade the monsters. Maybe he knows the way or can open the airlock," Ramirez said, his voice low but tinged with a faint hope. I nodded. Meeting such a person would be a stroke of luck, but it was dangerous to rely on it. Still, the thought that not everyone had turned into monsters offered a fragile sliver of hope. After several dozen steps, we reached a metal staircase descending into the depths. The emergency lamps midway down the flight glowed a dim reddish hue, casting an eerie light over the steps. We descended slowly, one by one, weapons at the ready. The cold metal chilled our gloved hands, and the echo of our footsteps filled the stairwell. At one point, a faint glimmer of eyes below caught my attention, as if something was watching us from the darkness. The captain raised his rifle, but the figure disappeared before he could fire. Once again, we were left in unsettling uncertainty. At the base of the stairs, we came to massive sealed doors. White painted letters, faded and cracked, spelled out BIOS, Sector. These doors had clearly been part of some isolation system. Now the right panel was partially crumpled, as if struck by something heavy or forced outward from within. Squeezing through the warped gap, we entered a vast chamber resembling a central hub. From here, hallways branched off in several directions. Some doors bore signs like experimental chambers, vivarium, and cryo units. The air was heavier here, filled with the stench of stale chemicals, decay, and something animalistic. The smell alone made my muscles tense and my hands tremble. We pressed on, trying to determine our next move. The engineer pressed against a wall, examining another terminal. This time we got lucky. The emergency power we had activated above fed into part of this level. A schematic of the sector flickered to life on one of the screens. Sam stood beside him, reading aloud. There, on the left, it says, Quarantine Control Station. We might find something useful there. And on the right, there's a long corridor marked Emergency Airlock. That sounds promising. We go to the airlock, the captain said curtly. He always chose the most direct route. But from deeper in the corridor came a sound, a low growl or moan. We had to be ready for a fight. Entering the hallway leading to the airlock, the emergency lights grew steadier but no less oppressive. Bloodstains streaked the floor, long since dried, and deep claw marks scored the walls. One room's door had been torn outward, revealing empty cages within. The bars were bent and some broken, as if holding those who had turned into monsters, or the beasts whose DNA was used to create the hybrids. Suddenly, from behind us, a voice called out, hoarse, rasping, almost inhuman, "Stop! Don't shoot." We turned swiftly. Standing in the half-open doorway of another room was a figure. Human, or at least what had once been human. The body was thin, patches of fur sprouting from the neck and arms. The face retained some human features, but the eyes glowed with a dull amber light, and clawed hands twitched nervously, opening and closing. He wore a tattered lab coat, frayed and torn in multiple places. We raised our weapons, but the captain motioned for us to hold fire. This could be the hybrid scientist we had speculated about. The figure stepped forward cautiously, raising its hands in what could be interpreted as a gesture of peace. You're not fully infected," the captain said, eyeing the creature. "I injected the antidote." "Not enough to stay human, but enough to keep them from attacking me," the hybrid rasped. "I know the way, but you'll have to help me." We exchanged glances. The captain lowered his rifle slightly, but kept it ready to snap back into position if necessary. "If you know the way to the emergency airlock, lead us," he said. "We'll help, but no tricks." The hybrid nodded, his strange eyes glinting in the dim light. He began moving down the corridor, and we followed. His movements were jerky, hesitant, as though he feared something unseen. When we approached a junction, he spoke in a raspy voice without turning around. "You have to get out. This base? It should have been destroyed long ago. What they did here, it's a mistake we're all paying for." There was a strange, almost remorseful tone to his words, but none of us pressed him for details. The monsters didn't seem to attack him, but that could change if they sensed us nearby. "They smell fear and blood," the hybrid said, almost as if he could read our thoughts. "When I became half-human, my scent changed. I'm neither man nor beast. They ignore me. But you, to them, you're prey. How do we stop them?" Sam asked. "Is there a way to secure the exit? If you activate the emergency containment system in the control room, you can seal off the corridors." "That'll protect the path to the airlock," the hybrid replied, pointing a clawed finger toward a side passage we'd passed moments earlier. "The console is old, but it should still work. If you activate it, the airlock doors will be reinforced, and you can get out." The captain pressed his lips together in thought. Going back to the control room was risky, but without sealing the corridors, the monsters would swarm us the moment we started working on the airlock. "All right, take us to the control room," he ordered. "But remember, if this is a trap, I'll shoot you without hesitation." The hybrid nodded, seemingly unfazed. We retraced our steps and soon entered a room with several consoles and switches. The floor was cluttered with debris, and some of the equipment was shattered. The hybrid approached the central console, his clawed fingers running over the buttons. He smirked grimly. "This needs a code," he said. "I remember it. But it changes periodically. If I guess wrong, it'll trigger an alarm. An alarm will wake up every creature in the base," the engineer muttered. We stood frozen. The situation was a stalemate. Without the code, we couldn't activate the containment system. Guessing would bring the monsters down on us. The captain gave the hybrid a pointed look. "You said you knew the code." "I know the old code," the hybrid corrected. "But it might have changed. This terminal is connected to the main computer. We need the administrator's terminal. There's one on the upper level of the lab sector. If we can access it, I can override the system." A collective sigh escaped us. Back upstairs? The situation was getting more complicated with every step. Was this just another round of wandering through the base, chasing codes and keys? "This will take too long," Ramirez whispered. "By the time we finish, we'll be out of strength." The hybrid squinted and added, "There's another way. I still have a syringe with a partial antidote. If one of you takes it, your scent will change, and the monsters won't distinguish you from me for a while. We could walk past them without triggering the alarm and head straight for the airlock, but it's a risk. You'll start mutating, like I did, if you don't find the full antidote." We stared at each other. The suggestion was both tempting and horrifying. The engineer bit his lip. Sam frowned, and Ramirez shifted closer to the captain. I could see the captain weighing the risks. If we took this path, one of us would become half-human. If we failed to escape or find the full antidote, they would remain that way forever. "How long would we have after the injection?" the captain asked. "A few hours, no more," the hybrid replied. "It'll be enough to leave the base, if you get the airlock open quickly." The captain looked over our group. We'd already lost several teammates, and the survivors were at their limits. No one wanted to become a monster. But if this was our only chance to survive, trying to crack the code manually would undoubtedly draw attention. The monsters would surround us in no time. "I'll do it," I said, surprising even myself. The words left my mouth before I could think them through, but there was no taking them back now. The captain's sharp gaze locked onto me. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "Someone has to. We won't make it otherwise. If this gives us a chance, I'm in." His eyes hardened, but there was a glimmer of respect. He understood the sacrifice. The hybrid handed me a syringe filled with cloudy liquid. I pulled off my glove, rolled up my sleeve, and pressed the needle into my arm. The pain was immediate and searing, as if acid were coursing through my veins. I gritted my teeth, trying not to cry out. My body trembled violently, and my vision darkened. I felt my muscles tense, a strange taste filling my throat, and my sense of smell sharpening unnaturally. "Breathe steadily," the hybrid said. "Soon your scent will change, and they won't see you as prey. But don't waste time." The captain placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Hold on. We won't forget what you've done," he said. I straightened as much as I could. My bones felt heavier, my senses sharper. I could hear faint rustles in the distance and distinguish scents with startling clarity. Rust, blood, burnt material, and a musky, animalistic odor. The hybrid's scent, once foreign and repellent, now seemed familiar, almost natural. On the other hand, the scent of my teammates, distinctly human, was sharper and more unsettling than ever, leaving me unnerved. "Now we can try to head directly to the airlock," the hybrid said, his gaze fixed on me. "The monsters won't recognize your scent. I'll go first, and you'll stay by my side. The rest of you," he added, turning to the group, "stay a little behind. If anything happens, don't run." Keep moving forward, calmly and without fear." The captain nodded and we left the room. Our goal was clear. Bypass the coded locks and alarms by risking a direct path to the emergency airlock, relying on this new advantage. Doubts and questions lingered in our minds. Was this the right decision? Would my sacrifice prove worthwhile? We moved deeper into the biosector, through dimly lit hallways. Changes coursed through me. My hearing, smell, and even vision were heightened. My heart raced, and the sharpness of human sense agitated me. But I maintained control. I was still human, just different. If everything went according to plan, we'd make it out alive. Ahead I heard heavy footsteps. A monster, 2, 3. I wasn't yet adept at identifying them. The hybrid signaled for silence and urged us forward. Then I saw the shadows of large creatures. They turned toward us but didn't charge or attack. To them, we were no longer intruders, perhaps a part of their pack or something uninteresting. I took a deep breath, gripping my weapon tightly but keeping it lowered. The captain followed close behind me, his tension palpable. We pressed on, each step taking us closer to the airlock. My only hope was that my transformation wouldn't progress too far before we escaped, and that the airlock wasn't sealed shut. We carefully navigated the corridors of the biosector, avoiding unnecessary attention from the creatures. The flickering emergency lights cast jittery reflections on the walls, leaving patches of absolute darkness. The hybrid, moving with a wolf-like stealth, led the way. I walked beside him, my altered senses taking in every detail. The dampness of concrete, the metallic tang of exposed wiring, the faint chemical trace lingering from abandoned equipment. And then there was the musky, overpowering scent of the creatures somewhere nearby. The monsters were surprisingly indifferent to us. I saw one emerge from a corner, a tall, hunched silhouette covered in matted fur. Its empty eyes scanned us, but didn't register a threat. Perhaps there had once been a human in this creature, but now only fragments of humanity remained. The beast sniffed the air, hesitated, and then disappeared into the shadows, slipping between metal partitions. Behind me, my teammates moved cautiously. I could hear their nervous breathing and the occasional dry swallow as they gripped their weapons tightly. The captain maintained a calm demeanor, but we all knew this was a gamble. If the hybrid betrayed us or led us astray, we'd be trapped among these creatures. If I lost control of myself, becoming more beast than man, it would endanger everyone. But we had no better options. The corridor began to widen into a laboratory-like space divided by cracked glass partitions. The glass was broken in places, with jagged edges bearing deep scratches as if someone, or something, had desperately tried to claw its way out. "This used to be an isolation zone," the hybrid said quietly, pointing to the shattered partitions with a clawed hand. "They kept test subjects here. First small animals, then humans." His voice carried a painful weight, a mix of bitterness and guilt. It seemed he had been part of this program, part of Project Z. The memory of what they'd done haunted him, even in his current half-mad state. We moved through the space cautiously, avoiding unnecessary noise. Occasionally, monsters passed by. One crawled on all fours, its long arms ending in razor-sharp claws. Another was short and stocky, with a pig-like snout and narrow yellow eyes. They didn't attack, but their presence was oppressive. I could feel the tension in my teammates behind me as they struggled to hold their fire. One wrong move, one shot or panicked reaction, and the thin veil of our masquerade would shatter. Finally, we reached a cleaner section of the facility. The emergency lights were steadier here, and signs hung on the walls. One read, "Emergency airlock, straight ahead." We quickened our pace. The hybrid seemed uneasy, glancing back at me. "Listen," he said in a low voice. "After you open the airlock, you'll need a dose of the real antidote, or the changes in your body will become permanent. I know where the antidote is stored." "Where?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could. It sounded rougher, raspier than usual. "In the specimen storage sector." "It's near the airlock," the hybrid said, pointing a clawed finger ahead. "I hope it's still there. I haven't been in that area for a long time." We approached a massive, hermetically sealed door surrounded by scattered crates and equipment. Above it, a sign read, "Emergency Airlock 02. This was the culmination of our journey. If we were lucky, we could open this door and escape to the outside, or at least to a safer tunnel leading to the surface. But we knew that the gates outside could still be locked. We had no idea what lay beyond the airlock, but we were prepared to take the risk. The captain signaled for us to stop. He approached the door and examined its control panel. It was a simple mechanical system. The airlock could be opened by routing power to the hydraulics and manually turning a large wheel. The problem was that the power supply was still unstable. "Engineer Sam, see if you can get power to the airlock," the captain ordered. The engineer removed the panel cover while Sam illuminated his work with a flashlight. I stayed nearby with the hybrid in my line of sight. He seemed to be helping us, but complete trust was out of the question. The rest of the team maintained a tight perimeter, silently monitoring the creatures that roamed just out of reach. As the engineer worked on the wiring, I felt a strange tingling in my hands. My nails seemed slightly longer, and I forced myself not to look. I couldn't dwell on what was happening inside me. The goal was clear. Survive long enough to get the antidote. "Just a little more," the engineer whispered. "Got it. Power's on." A green light blinked to life on the panel, and the hiss of hydraulics came from inside the door. The captain grabbed the wheel, and with help from Costa, one of our riflemen began turning it. The door groaned and began to open with a sharp screech. Then, a loud roar echoed through the corridors, carrying menace. The monsters had noticed our activity. Heavy footsteps sounded from the depths of the biosector. Several creatures, it seemed, were heading our way. "Faster," Ramirez whispered urgently. "They're coming." The captain and Costa strained, turning the wheel with all their strength. The door opened just enough to form a narrow gap, enough for someone to squeeze through, but more clearance was needed for safety. The engineer joined in, gripping a lever to help widen the opening. I held my position at the corridor entrance, watching the hybrid tense beside me. From around the corner, a group of creatures appeared. I counted 3, 1 tall and 2 smaller. They moved in quick bursts, leaning forward as if sniffing for something unseen. I prayed the altered scent masking us would hold, though the creatures seemed wary. Perhaps they smelled the metal of our gear or the faint traces of human fear. "Get people inside," the captain barked. Sam went first, clutching the radio and tools, followed by the engineer. Then Ramirez and Costa slipped through. I waited as the captain ushered the others in. The hybrid stayed by my side, watching me closely. "I'll go last," the captain said. "Cover us." I nodded, knowing I had to remain near the hybrid to stay undetected. The creatures crept closer. One halted just 10 yards away, staring directly at us. I forced myself not to lift my weapon. A single shot would ruin everything. The hybrid placed a clawed hand lightly on my shoulder, a reminder to stay calm. The door was now wide enough. I moved first, easing through the gap, careful not to let my weapon clank against the metal. The hybrid followed close behind. The captain remained outside for a moment longer, covering our retreat. The creatures were almost upon us. One stepped closer to the broken partition we had passed through. It paused, as if trying to make sense of our strange group heading toward the airlock. But it didn't attack. Perhaps it was still confused, or perhaps the masking effect was holding. At last, the captain slipped through the door. He nodded, and together we turned the wheel from the inside, sealing the door. The metal ground shut with a screech, separating us from the horrors of the biosector. The room we entered was dark and cramped, with a narrow corridor leading to another hatch. It seemed to be a transitional airlock, possibly connecting to the base's exterior sections. We turned on our flashlights. The captain exhaled heavily, checking to make sure everyone was accounted for. Our group was smaller than when we had started, but those who remained were still alive. "All right, hybrid," the captain said, addressing the creature. "You mentioned an antidote. Where is it?" The hybrid stepped back, leaning against the wall. His clawed hand ran over his tattered lab coat. "The sample storage sector is past the next chamber," he said. "I'll guide you. But be warned, there may still be security systems or remaining creatures. Not everything has left this place. Some of the more intelligent ones might set ambushes." "Intelligent?" Ramirez scoffed. "You mean they can think?" "Not like us," the hybrid replied. "But some retain skills from before their mutation. They know how to use cover and how to terrify their prey before striking." Sam exchanged a worried glance with the engineer. We all knew that rest would not come easily. My hands trembled, a sign I couldn't fully hide. My body warned me that time was short. While the creatures hadn't turned on us yet, I was increasingly anxious about my condition. We had to find the antidote soon. The corridor stretched ahead before bending to the left. We followed its rusty pipes, hearing the faint drip of water or chemicals. The emergency lighting flickered sporadically, occasionally plunging us into darkness, forcing us to rely on our flashlights. After several minutes, we reached a small hall marked sample storage. The reinforced door was slightly ajar, its valve jammed. The hybrid braced his shoulder against it and pushed. With a groan, the door opened. Inside, cold air greeted us, chilling our faces. This area had likely been climate-controlled to preserve biological materials. Now the systems were failing, leaving an uneven chill. Shelves held containers, refrigeration units, and shattered glassware. The room carried the heavy atmosphere of abandonment. We passed empty containers with suspicious stains before the hybrid stopped at a shelf in the back corner. A faded emblem with the letters Z and a numerical code was visible. The hybrid flipped open a compartment, rummaged inside, and retrieved a small metal case. "This should contain several doses of the antidote," he said. Using his claws, he opened the case and revealed 3 vials. "It's enough to stabilize the condition, but no more." The captain nodded. Relief swept through me, though caution remained. We had to confirm this was truly the antidote. The engineer inspected the vials carefully. They bore markings and a label that read, SUTZ-17, Stabilizing Formula. Sam cross-referenced this with the documents we had seen earlier. It appeared to be what we needed. I reached out, and the captain inserted one of the vials into the syringe injector. When the needle pierced my forearm, I felt a cold sting. The pain was weaker this time, almost faint. In fact, it became slightly easier to breathe, and the tingling in my hands began to subside. Perhaps I'd been stabilized. I could only hope that we had avoided any irreversible consequences. "What's next?" Ramirez asked. The hybrid scanned the room with his sharp eyes. "That corridor to the left leads to the outer airlock. If we're lucky, it won't be locked. If it is, we'll need to find a control panel on the other side. But for now, you're closer to the exit than you've ever been." We braced ourselves. One more barrier, another test. But now we weren't alone. We had a guide, even if he was half human, half beast. I had been stabilized for now. Part of our team was still alive and we were armed. "Let's move," the captain said in his usual calm tone. "We've come too far to stop now." We carefully advanced down the damp tunnels, inhaling the stale, heavy air. The hybrid led us through a narrow corridor, its walls slick with condensation. The weak beams of our flashlights revealed rusted pipes, exposed rebar, and crumbling concrete. Somewhere ahead lay the exit, or at least the secondary airlock. With every step, we clung to the hope that it would lead us to the surface and away from this nightmare. After another turn, we entered a small maintenance chamber. It was colder and drier here. The emergency lights barely worked, and we had to rely on our flashlights to see. We stopped so the engineer and Sam could inspect a power panel, hoping to supply energy to the airlock door ahead. The hybrid hovered near them, occasionally glancing nervously over his shoulder. I stayed close, covering them, while Ramirez and Costa guarded the rear. The captain remained at the center, poised to make decisions at a moment's notice. Tension gripped us all. The monsters hadn't openly attacked in some time, but their presence lingered in every faint rustle and distant sound. Suddenly the hybrid froze, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. He turned his head sharply toward the corridor we had come from. A chill ran down my spine. "What is it?" the captain asked in a whisper. The hybrid slowly raised a clawed hand and pointed into the darkness behind us. I directed my flashlight toward the corridor but saw only emptiness. The hybrid hissed, "He's here. The Alpha. They never let him lead the charge. He's smarter, more cunning. He knows you're trying to escape." The words landed like a death sentence. We exchanged uneasy glances. An Alpha? A leader among these creatures? Until now, we thought the monsters acted on instinct, chaotic and primal. If one of them could strategize, we were in far deeper trouble than we'd imagined. "Get the power running faster," the captain ordered hoarsely. The engineer and Sam scrambled to work on the wiring, their hands trembling with urgency. A faint scraping of claws against metal echoed through the corridor. Then, a hollow thud. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the noise and caught a glimpse of a shadow slipping behind a column. Something large and powerful circled us, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A sudden, guttural roar broke the silence, reverberating through the chamber and shaking the ground. For a moment, the corridor seemed to tremble. Costa fired a burst of bullets toward the sound. Sparks flew as they ricocheted off the walls, but he hit nothing. "Careful, don't provoke him." The hybrid hissed, but it was too late. A massive figure darted out from the shadows. It was larger than the others, its dark fur gleaming in the dim light. Its eyes shone with intelligence, and its movements were calculated, almost surgical. Before Costa could react, the Alpha was upon him, claws slicing through his throat. Blood sprayed, and Costa collapsed without a sound. Ramirez shouted, his voice lost in the wet tearing of flesh. We opened fire. Bullets cracked against the walls and ricocheted into the darkness, but the Alpha dodged effortlessly, moving with precision. The engineer screamed as the beast slashed through him, tearing away half of his face. Sam tried to back away, but the Alpha pounced on him, throwing him to the ground and ripping him apart as if he were nothing but cloth. The hybrid lunged at the Alpha, snarling, baring his fangs in a desperate attempt to hold it back. They collided in a violent, bloody clash. The hybrid clawed and bit at the Alpha, but the larger beast overpowered him. Blood spattered the walls as they wrestled, and then, with terrifying strength, the Alpha hurled the hybrid against the wall. He crumpled to the floor, gasping and writhing in pain. I fired a short burst, aiming for the creature's head. One bullet grazed its skull, splintering bone or horn. The Alpha roared in pain. Momentarily stunned, the captain fired as well, his shots deliberate and precise, forcing the Alpha to retreat briefly. Ramirez dropped to his knees beside Costa, shielding the lifeless body. But it was too late. Costa was gone. Ramirez raised his weapon, but the Alpha struck again, its claws slicing through Ramirez's midsection. His dying gasp echoed in my ears as everything around me blurred. Now it was just me and the captain. The Alpha stood between us and the airlock, blood dripping from its wounds but showing no sign of retreat. It wasn't like the others. Its movements were measured, deliberate. It studied us with chilling precision, as though calculating its next move. This wasn't just a beast. It was something far more terrifying. A predator with intelligence, one that seemed to understand our intentions and was intent on stopping us. He understood that we were trying to escape. The beast's eyes burned with a crimson fire as it moved toward us, step by deliberate step, savoring the agony of our group. "Go, Captain," I whispered, feeling the searing pain in my side. When the beast attacked, one of its claws had grazed me, and now blood trickled in a thin stream beneath my armor. The captain looked at me. We understood each other without words. He needed to get out, to report what had happened. I was injured. Even if we both made it, I would only slow him down. He had to leave now while I covered him. This was our last chance. At least one of us needed to survive and tell the truth. "I'm not leaving you," the captain whispered, his jaw clenched. "You have to," I replied, forcing my voice to stay firm despite the pain. "If no one makes it out, no one will know. Go. I'll hold him off." The Alpha tilted its head, as if it were listening to us. It hesitated, perhaps relishing the scene of despair unfolding before it. I raised my rifle and stepped out from behind cover. Each second stretched into eternity. The captain assessed the situation. He reached out, patted my shoulder, and moved toward the airlock. While I stood face to face with the monster, he began entering the code into the panel. The power we'd restored was active. I could hear the faint hum of hydraulics beginning to engage. The beast growled, realizing what we were trying to do. I fired again, hitting it in the side. The creature charged at me with inhuman speed, knocking me to the ground. My rifle flew from my hands. It lunged, claws aiming for my face, but I managed to block it with my knife. The blade plunged into the beast's chest, and it howled in rage. Its claws raked across my ribs, and I felt something crack inside me. Behind me, I heard the metallic clang of the airlock doors. The captain was leaving. He was doing the right thing. He had to escape and tell the world about the nightmare we'd endured. I would hold the Alpha as long as I could. Blood seeped through my armor, and each breath became harder. A thought flickered in my mind. What if the wound wasn't just a cut? The infection the hybrid had mentioned. Perhaps I was already feeling it. But there was no time to dwell on that. The Alpha roared and lunged again. The creature pressed me to the floor, its eyes blazing with a hunger for death. I drove the knife deeper, but it only enraged it further. Its claws sank into my shoulder and I screamed, refusing to let go of the blade, twisting it in a desperate attempt to wound it more severely. If I could distract it, injure it enough to give the captain more time. A distant clang echoed. It could have been the sound of the captain stepping through the airlock door. Or perhaps he'd found a way out. I didn't know, but I could feel my strength fading. The Alpha was too powerful. My blood mixed with its own, pooling on the floor. My fate was sealed. but I had done everything I could. I looked into the creature's eyes. In those moments, I saw nothing human, only madness and hunger. My comrades had died. The hybrid who had tried to help us was gone too. I hadn't been able to save them, but I had given the captain a chance. The blade trembled in my grip. I exhaled and tried to smirk, even as my throat burned with internal bleeding. Let the Alpha know. I hadn't broken. I had done what I had to do. Helped my captain escape. Ensured the knowledge of this horror would reach the surface, and prevented this terror from spreading further. Then the beast lunged again, and darkness enveloped me. I accepted my fate without fear, hoping that above ground, the captain was already calling for reinforcements, alerting them to what had happened. Let them know. Let them end Project Z and its monstrous creations. My final thoughts turned to my comrades. We had done all we could. From the captain's perspective, I managed to escape that cursed place. My men fell one by one in the depths of the abandoned Project Z facility. We had gone there to uncover the truth, but we left with nothing. My comrades, my team, nearly all of them gave their lives. One in particular, he sacrificed himself to buy me the time to flee, while the last monster tore into him. When I emerged onto the surface, my legs barely carried me. Normally steady and decisive, I now trembled with shock and exhaustion. The night air was cold, the stars sharp against the black sky. I raised my radio and attempted to contact command. My voice was hoarse and hollow, but I knew they heard every word. This is the captain, over. The base in Big Bend is fully compromised. The threat is out of control. Everyone is dead but me. I repeat, everyone is dead. Requesting immediate airstrike. The site must be leveled. These creatures. I paused, the memories flashing before me. They cannot be allowed to escape. A response came through the static after a brief pause. Understood, Captain. Deploying a strike team. Stay clear of the site. Coordinates confirmed. Evac helicopter inbound in 10 minutes. Over and out. I inhaled the cold night air, trying to steady myself. My heart still pounded in my chest, as though remembering the horrors I had survived. I took a few shaky steps over the rocky terrain, putting as much distance as I could between myself and the entrance to the underground labyrinth. The faint hum in the sky signaled that the time had come. At first, there was a distant whistle, the strike aircraft closing in on their target. I dropped to the ground between the rocks, shielding my head with my arms. In the sky above, fiery explosions lit up the darkness, followed by the thunder of engines and the roar of missile strikes. They rained down on the mountain slope and into the depths of the shafts. I could feel the ground tremble and hear the collapse of stone. This was humanity's answer to the nightmare lurking below. When the noise subsided, I got to my feet, shivering from the cold and my own weakness. In the distance, the lights of the evac helicopter appeared. It descended onto a relatively flat patch of ground between the rocks. Stumbling, I approached and raised my hand to signal them. Moments later, I was inside, sprawled on the hard floor of the cargo bay, surrounded by pilots and a medic. "Are you the only one?" the pilot asked me. "Yes," I exhaled. "It's over. The base has been leveled." The helicopter climbed higher, pulling away from the site of the bombing. I leaned back, trying to push away the pain and horrors of what had happened. But something felt wrong. My throat burned, my muscles cramped, and a strange tingling crawled under my skin, a heaviness settling in my bones. Once we had reached a safe altitude, the medic approached me to check my wounds. "Open your vest. Let me take a look," he said. I tried to undo the straps, but my hands trembled. Images of my team being torn apart flashed in my mind. Then I noticed something strange. I could hear the medic's heartbeat, strong and vibrant. I could smell him, warm, alive, full of life. His fear was palpable, though he didn't yet know what he should be afraid of. Pain flared through my body, sharp and unbearable. I gasped for air, the pilots shouting something at me, but their words blurred into an indistinct roar. My nails scratched at the metal floor as if instinctively. My vision turned yellow, distorted but strangely clear. I could see every detail of the cockpit, hear the creak of bolts, and feel the rhythmic breaths of everyone on board. A chilling realization struck me. The beast had wounded me. That's why I survived. I'd been infected during the fight. The growl that erupted from my throat was no longer human. The medic recoiled, fumbling for morphine or anything he could use. The pilots turned, their faces pale with terror. I lunged forward, unable to control myself. My teeth, yes, I had teeth now, sharp and deadly, sank into flesh. The scream that followed was both horrific and satisfying, warm blood filling my mouth. It was revolting and intoxicating at the same time, my mind torn between the remnants of humanity and an overwhelming primal hunger. The helicopter lurched violently as one of the pilots lost control in his panic. The engine screamed, the aircraft spiraling out of control. I couldn't stop myself. My hands, no claws, ripped through the soft interior as I moved. One pilot attempted to dive the helicopter sharply, perhaps hoping to throw me off. But I was faster, stronger. I felt the rotors slicing through the air in a desperate, chaotic dance. The world turned upside down. Metal screeched as we collided with trees, the rotor blades shattering branches before the helicopter crashed into the ground with a deafening roar. Sparks flew, metal twisted, and screams were abruptly silenced. When the noise faded, I crawled out of the mangled wreckage through a gaping hole. Smoke and the stench of jet fuel filled the air, but I didn't care. The transformation had been swift, as if the wound I'd received acted as a catalyst. The antidote I was given earlier had perhaps only delayed the process, not stopped it. I could no longer think like a human. Feral rage had consumed my mind. Fangs, claws, and animalistic eyes were now my reality. I raised my head and saw the moon faintly glowing through the branches of the trees. The sense of pine, damp earth, and living creatures around me overwhelmed my senses. I stepped forward, stumbling over the remnants of my uniform. I was now a predator, driven by a ravenous hunger. There was no thought of rescue, no lingering hope of salvation. My mind was clouded with the urge to kill. I could hear the faint, distant heartbeats of those living in the forest, humans, animals. It didn't matter anymore. Everything was prey. I moved deeper into the woods, disappearing among the shadows and branches, led by an insatiable hunger, ready to tear apart anything alive that crossed my path.